modern-day Bulgaria, where they can find peace and where they won't be in these constant skirmishes with neighboring Gothic peoples. He translates the Bible there during this time of peace. And what we find with Ulfilas, we're going to find with lots and lots of missionaries after Ulfilas, not just in antiquity, clearly, but also in the modern period. And what do these missionaries do, or these people that I'm all sort of grouping together as missionaries? Well, they translate the scriptures, and very often to do that, they have to come up with an alphabet. Such is Ulfilas' case. He translates scriptures, but to do that, he has to come up, the Goths don't have a literature at this point, he has to actually come up with a written form for their language. And praise God that he did. We as English-speaking people are indebted to him. People will look to Ulfilas' translation as effectively the oldest form of English that there is. It's also the oldest form of German, but our language, being a Germanic language, traces its history back in some form to this Gothic language, and Ulfilas' translation of the scriptures is the first piece of literature that we have in this language. So you can all thank Ulfilas for his contribution to your cultural experience. Interestingly, or I think curiously, Ulfilas does not translate, so he translates a lot of the scripture. Very little of it do we have. We have the Lord's Prayer and some snippets from the Gospels and some other things, but we have very little of it. You can't really read it without studying it as a foreign language. You can read English back to about the time of Chaucer and kind of make sense of it, back to the time in the 1300s with Wycliffe's Bible. You can kind of read Wycliffe's Bible. It brings you to laughter quite often. I remember I was looking at a Wycliffe Bible at a scriptorium, and I was looking at the Ten Commandments. And there was one commandment, you shall not commit lechery except with your wife. I thought, that's a bizarre translation, but I think you understand it, but boy, is that a weird way to put it. And you can understand English back to about the 1300s, back 1,000 years before that with the Goths. No, you really need specialty knowledge to be able to make sense of it. Interestingly, Ulfilas did not translate Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles, the books of Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles in his Bible, because his argument was that his people were warlike enough and they needed no further inspiration for war. This is Ulfilas' in some sense then this first instance of a Christian missionary working out an alphabet to bring the scriptures into the language of the people group, as we would say, that he's working with, to bring that into their native tongues. Ulfilas is working before the empire really begins to deteriorate. Let me tell you about another chap here, Patrick of Ireland, whose life and mission work does really start to tell that story of as the empire was falling, here we have a new opportunity for the gospel. Let me tell you the story of Patrick of Ireland. Patrick of Ireland's dates are about 389. That's a very loose date, but somewhere in the late 4th century and into past the middle of the 5th century, so about 389 to about 461. There's lots and lots of legends about St. Patrick that are clearly false, but there's some good information that we have about St. Patrick, too. He's not just the person that we celebrate in March with balloons and green popcorn, but was a real person, in fact, and this saint who brought Christianity in a stronger form to Ireland. Now, Christianity had come with the Roman Empire up to as far as England, to use modern geographical boundaries. England was never entirely within the grasp of the Roman Empire. So you remember there's a site that you can visit today, Hadrian's Wall. Oh, good. I can see that my cursor isn't showing up. Hadrian's Wall. And that marks, here, not as far as Scotland, it marks the furthest north that the Roman Empire was able to enter into England, And that was built, that wall there was built under the time of Hadrian. So after Trajan, this is Hadrian dies in 138 AD. So in the 2nd century, much of what we call the UK, much of England was under the control of Rome, but it had been late in coming and was one of the first territories to be lost. And sort of as the Roman Empire was atrophying, these English territories were quickly lost. But Christianity had come as far as England in the 2nd century with the Roman Empire. Tertullian, too, in the 2nd century will make references to Christianity in England. So it had come at an early stage. But as and Patrick's family was a Christian family from England that had received Christianity during this early period of the evangelization of the English peoples. Yet, Christianity had not made it as far as Ireland, and Patrick's influence, in fact, was going to have a lot to do with the rejuvenation, this renewal of Christianity that takes place in England as well. Any of you visited Hadrian's Wall? I never have. I wish that I have. Troy, do you remember any cities that are nearby? Okay, I was trying to plot. I'll have to look it up myself to remind myself exactly where that is, but good. Others, too, like Palladius, someone whose name we'll mention, but we're not going to get into the details. He had been working in Ireland before Patrick, but Patrick is a main character in this rejuvenation of Christianity that takes place in England and the spread of Christianity to Ireland. So let's mention him and talk about Patrick. Patrick was raised in a Christian home. And when he is about 16 years of age, he's kidnapped. Kidnapped by pirates, sold into slavery in Ireland. He's a slave there for about 6 years. And what was he doing while he was there but tending sheep? He finally escapes, and when he escapes, he runs back to his homeland, back to England. Patrick's education was interrupted during this time, and seems to have felt badly about that for the rest of his life. One of the things that it seems that Patrick sort of impressed on Irish Christianity was this love for learning. Perhaps Patrick was trying to pass on to those who were younger and had another chance at this what he had missed in his youth. And Irish Christianity was to take this very rigorous intellectual form, not the sort of intellectual form that we might think of in a post-Enlightenment culture, but this intellectual form for early Irish Christianity meant a how would you say, they were all bibliophiles. I can't think of how to make that an adjective, but this culture that loved books, that dedicated itself to the reproduction of books, and that the monastic tradition of which was thoroughly engaged in this activity of reproducing Christian scriptures and ancient knowledge. So that's one of Patrick's influences too. It seems that he really impressed this love of learning on the Irish Christians that he worked with. Okay, but we've left Patrick back at home ruining his education. He receives this dream, very much like the dream that the Apostle Paul receives in Acts 16, sort of a Macedonian vision type dream. And in this dream, Patrick, now safely back at home, enjoying his time with his family, sees this Irish man who's calling to him and saying, "Holy boy, come back and walk among us again and help us." So Patrick believes, sadly, that he's heard the voice of God. He's got to go back to Ireland, despite the fact that he really doesn't want to. He heads back to Ireland and sets up, works for the rest of his life, setting up Christian communions, Christian churches and monasteries in Ireland, and works with the Irish to set up a form of Christianity that really suits them, that really makes sense to their native temperament. What kind of Christianity was that? Well, it was a decentralized Christianity. It was a Christianity that the bishops or overseers would be itinerant in some regard. They would travel from church to church, preaching here and preaching there. It was a Christianity that was thoroughly ascetic. It was a Christianity where monasticism flourished. Some of these themes overlap with Roman Christianity, some not so much. In the theme like asceticism, where we think that it would match up well with Roman Christianity, it does in a way, but the Irish form of this Christianity was much more extreme in their asceticism, much more removed, much more harsh in their practice of asceticism than the Roman forms. So under Patrick's influence, Irish Christianity begins to really develop its own temperament and take on its own character. Have you, any of you remember that book by Thomas Cahill, How the Irish Saved Civilization? Came out now quite a while ago, but do any of you remember it? It's probably been 12 years or so. One or two of you remember it, maybe? Yep, okay. Patrick has a lot to do with that story. In that book, Thomas Cahill chronicles how it was actually Irish learning and this monastic tradition that developed in Ireland, where books were preserved and love of learning was preserved, that had a lot to do with the rejuvenation of the intellectual world of the medieval European, this renewal of the European medieval world, when Charlemagne, another century or two or three down the road, when in the early 9th century, Charlemagne is trying to erect church schools, and this network of church schools, he's going to call on Irish monks, specifically Alcuin of York, but he's going to recruit Irish monks as well to bring their love of learning and also their libraries with them down to Aachen, Germany, as they begin to rejuvenate ancient learning on the European continent. So the Irish are going to play a very important role in this preservation of European knowledge during the fall of Rome and into the early Middle Ages. Now, I've mentioned that under Patrick, Irish Christianity begins to take on its own form. This is going to change at a very important meeting that takes place in 664 called the Synod of Whitby. The Synod of Whitby. It's during this period, during this moment, that Roman Christianity is going to exert influence and do a lot to synchronize Irish Christianity with it. So the extremes of Irish monasticism, the irregularity of their festivals, and the dates in which they celebrate various things in their liturgical calendars, some of the things about the uniquenesses of their Christian practice, whether it be something small, like the way that they practice the tonsure, that is that special haircuts that monks get, or whether it was something more significant, like the way they structured bishops over their priests. All of these sort of irregularities of Irish Christianity were going to become synchronized with Rome at the Synod of Whitby. But as we move forward, and we'll return to this later in this, in various at various points in this class and next semester's class, as we look at this relationship between English Christianity and Roman Christianity, this moment is going to be a very important moment, the Synod of Whitby, because there will be times further on in the life of the English Church where they would like to keep an element of independence or remind themselves of this earlier history when they were independent from Rome. Most prominently in the 16th century, when the English Church is going to break off from Rome, it's going to be very important for these English Christians to remember that they had a period in time when they were actually, in many ways, independent from Roman Christianity. This break from Roman Christianity in 1534 with King Henry VIII and so on, and we'll get to that story in due time. That was not an entirely unique event. So for English Christianity, it's going to be, because of the way things work out through Reformation years, it's going to be important to remember that there was this time of independence and uniqueness to their religious practice. What is it that we're looking at here, scholars? What's this building? Any of you recognize it? As far as I know, none of you have decided to do your sacred space project on it. Quite sure that none of you did, which is fine. What are we looking at? This is St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City. Sierra, you've been there, I take it? Yeah. The Irish immigrants that came back to New York City in the late 1900s, I think it was late 1900s, I'll have to check, could have been early 20th century, but I think it was late 1800s, built this magnificent cathedral in New York City dedicated to their patron saint, the patron saint of the Irish, St. Patrick. St. Patrick hasn't left us much literature, and I suppose we should have guessed that given the harshnesses of his living conditions and practice of Christianity, but also the way that he rued his education. He was never very confident as an author, but he did leave to us something called the Confessions, not to be confused with Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Confessions or Augustine's Confessions or any of these others, but it's a very small book, could be read really in about an hour, maybe just over an hour, if you want to read it and savor every line. But there's some biographical information that we can derive from these confessions, but there's a lot that tells us about the character of Irish Christianity too. Patrick had been, as a slave, out watching sheep, out in the open, out in the elements, taking care of these animals. There's a lot about his spirituality that exposes a clear interest and awareness of nature. A lot of his metaphors, like David's metaphors in the Psalms, a lot of his metaphors are very natural, speaking about these earthy realities and how they bring us closer to an experience of God. So much for St. Patrick of Ireland. Any questions? Any thoughts or comments? Marcus. Good. Fire and sword. So when is it conversion by force? Is that the question? Good. Well, we'll see some of that under the among the early Frankish tribes. So with the Merovingians, we'll see some of that actually pretty soon. So like pre-Charlemagne history, we'll see some of that. These Clovis I is going to be the first, quote, Christian king of the Franks. He's going to convert to Catholic Christianity, that is non-Arian but Trinitarian Catholicism. And he's going to make it part of his mission to go out and conquer those Arian Christians and surrounding tribes and convert them to Catholic or Trinitarian Christianity. So that comes to mind as a strong example of that. I don't think it was ever official policy of it was not Charlemagne. Well, Charlemagne probably engaged in some of that too. I think you'll see patches of that. You'll see patches of that here and there. Part of what makes it difficult to speak of a grand policy of fire and sword evangelism there, Marcus, would be that during these late antique years and early medieval years, the empire is so fragmented that we'll see this tribe or that tribe or this small coalition perhaps engaging in that type of activity, perhaps Charlemagne, perhaps some of the early Merovingian kings, but it's hard to speak of some sort of grand policy just because there's not the political structure to really do that, as there would be in later years like the Spanish Inquisition or something like that. That would just be a different story because the political environment would be so much different. Does that help, Marcus? Is that useful to you? Okay. Any other questions? Let me tell you the story about Columba. Columba of Scotland. So Patrick is a large part of the story of how Christianity comes to Ireland, at least no doubt the most famous of the missionaries who came to Ireland. There were others. But how did Christianity continue to spread northward, specifically to Scotland? Here's the story. The story is that of Columba, a man born around the year 521 and who died around the year 597. Columba was an Irish Christian. been reared as a Christian all his life in this sturdy, robust Irish Christianity that St. Patrick had done so much to foster. He was pious, he was living the life of a monk, he loved study as so many Irish Christians did. He was studying with the best tutors in Ireland, and already within a few generations, the educational offerings in Ireland had become significant. He was doing small missions with brothers around the surrounding regions, but in 561, when Columba was about 40 years old, he got into serious trouble. Here's the story. His mentor had brought a copy of a manuscript of one of Jerome's commentaries all the way back from Rome. Now, books were comparatively very, very rare at this time, despite this tremendous love of learning that had been growing on Irish soil. But it was really something extraordinary to get this book back from Rome, a copy of one of Jerome's commentaries. Jerome, even at that time, was an outstanding, an author of outstanding reception, just an extraordinarily popular person. So this was an extraordinarily very valuable book. Columba took the book and copied it out, made his own copy of it. And this was something that was not to be done. Columba and his mentor finally get into quite this feud, and it's very difficult for me to understand exactly how this happened. But as the story unfolds, there's this violent skirmish that takes place. It seems that Columba was in fact a cousin or a relative of the local chieftain, and so because of this political connection, this debate that was taking place in the monastery actually becomes a political debate and is decided on the battlefield, and people die over this. There's actually some sort of like minor civil war that breaks out, in this major skirmish, and Columba's forces triumphs because he's related again to this king. There's this terrible sense of remorse. Columba has this terrible feeling. Here he is trying to be a monk. He's trying to live a life of godliness and humility. And in fact, what happens? The civil war breaks out. It's terribly destructive for the surrounding people. So Columba decides to exile himself. Always a good thing to do. He sends himself, well, it's always a good thing to do if you have this harsh monastic mindset. He sends himself out to the island of Iona, where no one would want to go live, and sets up a monastery. The monastery actually becomes then, so he has this terrible backstory. He's sending himself out to go in isolation, but monasteries, especially at that time, tended to be successful enterprises, and other brothers joined into his mission. I don't know what they did to earn their exile, but they all exiled themselves together. They make sort of this mission group. They begin sending out themselves as sort of short-term missionaries to surrounding areas. Eventually, this center at Iona, this monastery, becomes a sort of a transfer station, or this point of entry into Scotland. It's actually an island off the coast of Scotland. The people who lived in Scotland, the Scots and the Picts, were these terribly violent peoples. So the Romans never actually conquered them, which they're still very proud of today. But with this little island outpost off of the coast of Scotland, they were sending missionaries into these dangerous spaces and actually making converts and Christianizing the people. And this monastery at Iona has a lot to do with the Christianization of Scotland. Good. Let me tell you one more story. And this will be the story of St. Augustine of Canterbury. St. Augustine of Canterbury. And this is the most famous of the missions, of these early missions to the English people. We've just talked about missions to Ireland and Scotland. There is a very famous mission to England, from Rome to England, with this Augustine of Canterbury chap. It takes place in the late 6th and early 7th century. For that reason, Christianity is already clearly in England. This isn't the first coming of Christianity to England, but is one of the most celebrated stories in the mission history of England, and also does show us how the English church would have been greatly strengthened, made more robust, and then also this is part of the influence of how we get to that Synod of Whitby in 664. What influences already were present from Roman Christianity in England before this very decisive moment in the middle of the 7th century when Irish Christianity and English Christianity generally was synchronized with Roman Christianity. The story of St. Augustine of Canterbury's mission goes as follows. He was sent by Gregory the Great. Gregory the Great was an aristocratic chap. He'd been raised in a very good environment or a socially stable environment and benefited from a wonderful Roman education and so on, and was a monastic but excelled as an administrator. He was Bishop of Rome from 540 to 604. Some will think of Leo I as the first pope, if you will. Many think of Gregory the Great, this guy, as the first pope. Let me ask you a question. As we talk about the first pope, what is the pope? What do I mean when I say this or that person was the first pope? That's a point that requires explanation. What do I mean? Go ahead, Marcus. What do you mean? I think you know exactly what you're talking about, Marcus, but I just want to have you make it explicit for the rest of us. What do you mean followers of Peter? Good. Yes, with that last ingredient, you've got everything that we need, Marcus. Good work. So, yes, these when we speak of the Pope, we're talking about the Bishop of Rome, but we're with the understanding that the Bishop of Rome is a special bishop, not just a bishop like one of the other patriarchal bishops, Bishop of Jerusalem or Bishop of Alexandria, these other very prominent churches in the early church that were understood to have a special authority. There were 5 patriarchs in the early church: Rome, Alexandria, Antioch, Jerusalem, and Constantinople. We have 5 patriarchs in the early church. The Bishop of Rome was one of those 5 patriarchs. At some point, the Bishop of Rome starts understanding himself to have a unique authority, not just in this group of 5 very special and prominent bishops, but there was a unique authority to this particular bishopric. The Bishop of Rome was a super bishop, if I can use a made-up term with you, a bishop above the bishops, a bishop over all of the other bishops, and that this bishop had the special authority of the commission that Jesus gave to Peter. We've got all the ingredients on the table there. Thanks, Marcus. So, rewind. When I speak of now, a Roman Catholic would speak of Peter as being the first pope. Peter is the first bishop of Rome. Wonderful. Linus is the second. Clement is the third, and so on, even from the very beginning of the middle of the 1st century. A Roman Catholic would say any bishop of Rome was the pope. The way that I, as a Protestant historian, and speaking of the word pope, is Gregory the Great. We could call him the first pope if we wish, because he is perhaps the first bishop who demonstrates a care to oversee the full church, all of the church, and to work with all of the bishops. He called himself, Gregory the Great called himself the servant of the servants of Christ. So he saw himself in his administrative duty as able to serve all of the other bishops in their duties as they served the church. Now, others before Gregory the Great had an awareness of their exceeding importance as the Bishop of Rome. We could look at Leo I, the man who sends Attila the Hun packing because he's able to negotiate a deal outside the gates of Rome and keep Attila the Hun from trashing the city. That's a real display of power. And it also shows that Leo understood that his responsibility of Bishop of Rome was not just for his flock, but for the whole city, and in some sense, for the whole Roman world, as he's preserving the image of the city of Rome. So, and then there's a debate with Cyprian and Bishop Stephen back in the 3rd century, where the Bishop of Rome will claim a special authority, a unique authority, based on that passage that Marcus has already alluded to, where Jesus is commissioning Peter with a special authority. So I'm calling Gregory the Great the first pope. I don't know if Palmer's going to choose to make that a test question, but in this class he might. But understand that's a question of perception and opinion when I speak of who could be the first pope. Gregory the Great, whatever though, had this tremendous sense of responsibility to the broader church. As the empire is fading and losing real power, Gregory is doing everything he can to make the church actually that organizing influence on people's lives, that it would be the church that would maintain civic structure in many ways. Gregory the Great worked very hard to build up networks and resources for the church to actually ensure the future and thriving of the church even during hard years. He also organized a very successful mission to England, and that's the specific point that I'd like to get to now. England became later this tremendous center of world mission. The English received the gospel enthusiastically at this very early date, and it seems that they became very eager to repay their debt and for the spread of the gospel message in later years. Here's how Gregory the Great came across his great idea to send a bunch of monks to England to shore up and to establish faith in England. Gregory the Great is walking through Rome, and he's walking through the part of the Rome where they happen to be selling slaves. And he sees some people that he thought looked pretty funny. He sees English people. Now, Gregory the Great, you have to imagine, is this sort of Armani model-looking guy. He's an Italian with this smooth olive skin. And he'd never seen these very funny Irish-looking people with their red hair, blue eyes, and very fair skin. So he asked the slave dealer, and he says, "Who are these people?" And the slave dealer says, "Well, they're Angles." And in the hagiography that we've received, Gregory the Great says, "They're not Angles, they're angels," and decides to set this mission to go back to England to work among these barbarian peoples. Good. Augustine is this monk who's chosen by Gregory the Great. They know each other from this monastic context, and Gregory the Great is going to send out Augustine. And Augustine turns out to be an outstanding administrator and very gifted evangelist as he leads this team out to England. Augustine sets out with about 40 brother monks, and they're heading out to England. Now, the map doesn't seem that from Rome. So here we are from Rome, and we're sending someone out. They're going to eventually land in Canterbury, England. That doesn't seem like such a terrible trek. During this time, as again, Roman Empire had largely collapsed, we have not much order here in the northern territories whatsoever. This was going to be a terribly perilous journey for their monks to actually get to England, and once they got there, they were going to be surrounded by all these barbarian peoples who were going to slay them and probably put them in some sort of boiling pot and eat them as cannibals afterwards. Actually, I'm kidding. I don't think they were cannibals, but you get the idea. This was going to be a terribly brave thing to do. We have the group finally does arrive in England. They settle in Canterbury. They almost turn around multiple times. It takes weeks for them to get there, and they think that they're going to be slain on the way or run out of food and starve, and this is a terribly difficult thing for them to do. You know, travel is just something that, just a moment of reflection here very quickly, it's almost impossible to imagine the adventuresomeness that it would take to travel in the ancient world, just because travel is nothing like it used to be at all. I went to Greece in 2007, and I was traveling from England to Greece. We took a short 4-hour flight from London Heathrow down to Athens. It was kind of fun because Heathrow's terminal number 5 was opened for the second day. It was like the most expensive airport terminal that had ever been built in history up to this point. It was like super automated and super plush, the Cadillac airport terminal. And that was the second day that it was opened. It was really exciting to actually see it, because the first day, nothing worked at all, and all these flights were canceled. But we actually did make it out on our flight to Athens in 2007. And on that trip with me, a bunch of English people, there was a man who had been an undergraduate at Cambridge. And he had been a classics student. He was probably in his 70s then. So I'm just doing the math now. He must have been a student probably in the 40s, something like that, 40s or 50s. He must have been a little older than that, because I think he studied at Cambridge in the post-war period. So, yeah, in the early 30s, I think, if my memory serves me rightly. He tells me about when he was a classics student at Cambridge, traveling to Greece, because he had done this a number of times as a young person, and he said that it took 3 days to get there. Right, first he'd take a train from Cambridge down to the port, then he'd take a boat, then he'd take a series of other trains and ferries, and eventually arrive in Athens 3 days later. That was like just 2 generations ago. It would take 3 days to do a trip that took us 4 hours in a plane, and that we don't really even think about. Well, that's all very recent development. So it is really difficult to imagine how adventuresome Augustine and his brother monks must have been to travel through this chaotic territory and to try to set up a civilization just hundreds of miles away, but that's worlds away in our terms. Augustine sets up his monastery in Canterbury, and for those of you who are wondering, that's still the reason why today the highest ranking ecclesiastical officer in the English church will be the Archbishop of Canterbury, right? That's the most prominent see in the Anglican Communion, because that's where Augustine landed. Augustine was faced with a number of very serious questions as he arrived. The most important of which was the question, we would call it the question of enculturation. So he's surrounded by pagans. He's brought this, if you will, pure Roman form of Christianity with him, and he's surrounded by all these pagan tribes, these barbarians. How much credence should he give to their practices and their feast days and the way that they practice religion? And how much should Augustine try to completely obliterate the old memory of those religions and to set up something new? We would call it, if you were in a missions class with Dave Viney or Dr. Klaus, we'd call this the question of enculturation. Augustine exchanges letters back and forth with Gregory back in Rome, and they're trying to figure this out and work together to actually come to some useful policies for these new missionaries. Here's what Gregory the Great writes back to Augustine, and this sort of sets the trajectory for Augustine's mission work there in England. Gregory writes this. He says, "The heathen temples of these people need not be destroyed. Only the idols which are to be found in them. If the temples are well built, it is a good idea to detach them from the service of the devil and to adapt them for the worship of the true God. And since the people are accustomed, when they assemble for sacrifice, to kill many oxen in the sacrifice to the devils, it seems reasonable to appoint a festival for the people by way of exchange. The people must learn to slay their cattle not in honor of the devil, but in honor of God and of their own food, and for their own food, excuse me. If we allow them these outward joys, they are more likely to find their way to the true inner joy. It is doubtless impossible to cut off all abuses at once from rough hearts, just as a man who sets out to climb a high mountain does not advance by leaps and bounds, but goes upward step by step and pace by pace." Did you understand his thought, his commentary there? What is Gregory's advice to Augustine and the monks as they work in England? I'm going to release you in a moment to do a discussion question, and so I would like to summarize with you quickly that bit of advice, that policy, if you will, that Augustine just received from Gregory. How would you summarize with me that policy? Go ahead, please. Yeah, let's see if we can massage that just a hair, but basically that's entirely the right idea. Yeah, so you preserve the modes of worship. Let's see if we can come up with a slightly more technical word for direction of worship. So you preserve, and actually even modes of worship we need to be a little careful with. So this is tentative, but worship, I'm going to say but replace the direction of their worship. Let's massage this just a little bit. How could we summarize Gregory's policy? We're getting the right idea. His theory is one of exchange. Keep as much as possible the conventions of the people's religion, in as much as he says that they may be used to meeting on a certain day. We'll keep that as the meeting day, but exchange the activity entirely. Don't let them sacrifice to the gods. You can feast. You can kill oxen for food. You can have a big meal, a big community meal, but don't do it in the worship of gods. Change that form of worship. How would you describe that policy? Go ahead, Chase. Okay, good. Yeah, that could do on a t-shirt just great. I'm not sure if I want to write that on the board. Let them party for Jesus is what I heard. Can you say that in slightly more technical language? Okay. I'm still uncomfortable with this word direction, so I need you all to help me through, either explain what you mean by direction in a way that's detailed enough for me to be settled about it, or let's come up with a new word. I'm pretty happy with convention. So preserve the convention of their worship, we'll say. That is the outward form of it. But to exchange the direction, I keep hearing this word direction. Go ahead, please. But replace the devotion of their worship? Is that your suggestion, Misty? Oh, okay, I can do that. Devotion here, so direction of their devotion. Then we even get this wonderful alliterated sentence. That's nice. Misty, you finally brought me around. Okay, I can see that. So that you're the direction of their devotion, make all of these activities an act of worship to God. You're directing the devotion, or the object of worship has changed. I'm sorry? Good. Okay. No, that's very helpful, Misty. Okay, so are we content with this statement as a policy statement from Gregory? You understand what that policy is that we've tried to explain out here together? Okay, if we can agree as a class on what Gregory the Great's policy was to Augustine, I want you all to take 10 minutes and to do a thought question. I just want you to respond to this. I want you to agree or disagree with Gregory the Great's recommendation to Augustine that he set up Christianity in England under this policy. agree or disagree with it as you wish, and I want you to argue why you agree or disagree with it. I'll only give you, because this is a, we could talk about this forever if we wanted to, or we could talk about it in a shorter period of time. I'm going to only give you 10 minutes, have a disciplined but hopefully very useful question about it. I love this question that comes up between Augustine and Gregory because it's so practical. This is something that anybody involved in evangelism in any programmatic way is going to face. And so I love the fact that it's practical. I want you to engage it, but I'll only give you 10 minutes. Go. Send your responses to Pete Elliott. And again, his email, I'll write up here for you. Go ahead, get in groups, and get to work, please. in. Let's take a 15-minute break. It'll be our only break during the class, so come back promptly at 9:20. We'll have a quiz to open up, so make sure that you're here promptly in order to take that. Thank you. Watch that, scholars. I stopped it 1 second before it went off. Do you always get up like 5 minutes before your alarm goes off? Okay, there we go. All right, so do find your seats. Everybody get set. And Palmer, whenever you're ready, you can lead us in our quiz.
Cool. Hello, hello, hello. Is everybody on Blackboard? I know some of you are on Blackboard. Does everybody want to get on Blackboard? For our first quiz of the day. Okay, let's begin. Question 1. I was an early Christian missionary to the Goths, presenting to them an Arian strain of the Christian faith and giving them a Gothic Bible. Who am I? A. Ulfilas, B. Wilfrid, C. Patrick, D. Columba, or E. Augustine of Canterbury?
Love the Who Am I format. That's great. Capitalized Bible there, Palmer.
Definitely. Question 2. According to the lecture, what are the dates of St. Patrick's life? A. 329 to 491 AD, B. 247 until 314 AD, C. 389 until 461 AD, D. 454 AD until 508 AD, or E. 601 until 676 AD? Question 3. In 561, I copied one of Jerome's commentaries that my mentor had brought to me. A minor civil war broke out due to the conflict that arose between me and my mentor, and I felt really bad about it, so I went to Iona and set up a monastery. Who am I?
I love it.
A. Ulfilas, B. Patrick of Ireland, C. Augustine of Canterbury, I keep wanting to say Augustine, D. Eusebius of Caesarea, or E. Columba of Scotland? And I believe that I'm justified in stopping myself from saying Augustine of Canterbury. I don't know if you want to comment on that after the quiz or right now.
I'll just comment on it. Really, either is fine. Augustine or Augustine for either figures. When last year when I was teaching this class, I tried pretty hard to keep it Augustine of Hippo and Augustine of Canterbury. But you know what? I think I'm going to actually stop that convention just because I can't keep it straight. So I'm just going to call everybody Augustine next year. But I've quietly kept that convention, so I introduced him to you as Augustine of Canterbury. But really, either's correct.
Question 4. Which of the following is not true of Augustine of Canterbury? A. At one point, terribly afraid of the perilous journey before him, Augustine almost gave up the life of a missionary before arriving in England. B. He was sent by Leo I to attend the Council of Chalcedon in 451 AD. C. He corresponded regularly with the Bishop of Rome concerning his evangelistic efforts. D. He was commissioned by Gregory the Great to lead an evangelistic team of monks to reach the English people. Or E. He set up his ecclesiastical headquarters in Canterbury, which is why the center of the Anglican Church is Canterbury.
Good question.
And question 5. Who is credited with having said, quote, "The people must learn to slay their cattle not in honor of the devil, but in honor of God and for their own food." End quote. A. Gregory of Nazianzus. B. Leo I. C. Augustine of Canterbury. D. Gregory the Great. Or E. Augustine of Hippo. Whoa, that felt weird.
Good questions, Palmer. Thank you.
That is the end of quiz 1.
Everybody get that through? No one's computer crashed? How wonderful. Let's just actually close the quiz then, unless somebody's computer didn't work. All right. Aha, we've taught you bad habits. Okay, so I guess leave it open for another 15 minutes, or what do we need to do so that everybody gets a fair chance? Yeah. Thanks. Thanks, everybody. Very good questions, Palmer. All right, let me see if I can finish up a few of these stories of Latin missions and give you just one or two more biographical sketches, and then I'll move us on quickly. Note that we're covering really a broad spectrum of time. We started with Ulfilas back in the 4th century, and we're going to end up, before we're done here, we're going to be talking about people in the 8th century. So just I want you to be aware that this is a very broad movement of time that we're discussing here. Let me introduce you to a couple other folks. There's a bunch of, there's actually a set of figures here, all with funny W names. I'll give you two of them in very, very brief form, and then I'll introduce a third of these these figures with this name W in a moment, a little bit more in detail. There's Wilfrid. That's W. Actually, I'll just write these out on the board. That's the only fair way to treat this. There's Wilfrid, who's going to be a he's going to bring the rule of Saint Benedict to England. His rough dates are as follows. There's Willibrord, the apostle to the Frisians. So for those of you who know as much, that's going to be the people group in Northern Europe up in modern-day Netherlands. And there's Boniface that we need to introduce to you as well. Oops, left that page here. Boniface or Winfrid is his English name. He's going to be apostle to the Germans. I'm going to put in his Latin name here, Boniface, as well. And with him, we are already then squarely into the 8th century. He dies in 754. Let me introduce a few of these folks to you. First two, and very, very brief. Wilfrid, maybe if you just want to remember one or two facts about him, excuse me, you can remember that he was the pro-voice or the positive voice at the Synod of Whitby. He's an English churchman who was very much in favor of the Synod of Whitby. Again, that's bringing English and Irish forms of Christianity into synchronization with Roman forms. Especially prominent at this debate at the Synod of Whitby were the practice of the tonsure and the practice of the particular date of the celebration of Easter. These then were celebrated in England as they were in Rome. Wilfrid also brings the rule of Saint Benedict to the English monasteries. We'll talk about the rule of Saint Benedict in time, but that becomes, Benedictine monasticism is unprecedented in its influence on European monasticism. When we get into the 12 and 1300s, we'll start talking about other forms of monasticism, Dominican monasticism, Franciscan monasticism, etc. But at this early time period, Benedictine monasticism basically is monasticism. There are Augustinian groups as well, but everybody's heavily influenced by this Benedictine form. So when Wilfrid is bringing the rule of Saint Benedict to the English monasteries, that's massively significant. He's bringing what will be the by far dominant form of European monasticism and Western monasticism to these English monasteries as well. Wilfrid, we can remember as a true pioneer missionary. He serves for a time in Mercia, which is Middle England, and in the middle of England. Missionaries are coming down from the north of England and spreading southward, and he's part of that wave of missions. So just a very quick thumbnail sketch of Wilfrid. Let me give you also a very quick sketch of Willibrord, whose name and dates I have for you there on the board. We could call Willibrord the apostle to the Frisians. Frisians, F-R-I-S-I-A-N. He's another one of these pioneer missionaries. In fact, Boniface, this later figure, third on the board, will join Willibrord's mission. So we see this overlap at this point. Willibrord travels down from England to the Netherlands, and again, it's just almost impossible for us to get into our imaginations what a significant journey, even such a small, it's an amazingly significant journey for these people, given the cultural boundaries that they're transcending, even though it's just a few miles on the modern map. At this time, the English were terribly afraid of the Frisians, this northern European people who had successfully resisted Roman rule, kept their territory safe from the Romans. Willibrord is going to become the first bishop of Utrecht in the Netherlands. The story is that Willibrord's teacher, Saint Egbert, sent Willibrord and 12 of his friends to evangelize the territories, now known as the Netherlands. And wouldn't you know it, 1,200 years later, a lot has happened. It's amazing. It is, to me, amazing how significant some of these early missions can be, even though there were just a few people involved in them. Saint Egbert, Willibrord's sender, had been asked by Pepin, and when we get to Charlemagne's time, we'll hear about who this King Pepin was, but a predecessor to Charlemagne down in the continental portion of Europe. So Saint Egbert had been asked by this Christian king back in Central Europe to send evangelists to the region now known as the Netherlands. They send, a lot happens. It's a very, very successful mission. And this is in fact the mission that Boniface joins. Let me spend the most time talking to you about Winfrid, or his Latin name is Boniface. Boniface meaning doer of good. He's given that name, I believe. Let's see, who did give him that name? I'll find the name of the Bishop of Rome who gives that name to him. I was recommending to one of you that if you want to read about some of these early missionaries, Boniface might be the one for you to read about, just because he left us the best paper trail. A lot of the other information that we have on these people is very fragmentary. Boniface has a wonderful set of letters. You can go to Gonzaga Library or any university library, pull out Boniface's letters and read them. There are a couple dozen there in a collection, a small collection, but very insightful into the nature of his missionary work and his objectives. I see there's the edition that I have, and I'd like to share that with you, The Letters of St. Boniface, translated by Ephraim Emerton from Columbia University Press. There's a nice edition that came out in 2000. There's other editions you could look back as well. He's one of the earliest and best-known missionaries. In the first 1,000 years of the Christian church, he's one of the best-known missionaries, period. In fact, he might be right up there with Augustine of Canterbury as contending for the very top position, as most famous missionary. He's in English history, in the stream of English historiography, he's especially revered because he's from England. And those who are very proud of the English people's history in world missions and what comes out later with Hudson Taylor and David Livingstone and these other very famous missionaries, William Carey and so on, they would rank Boniface is in that same line of his extraordinary missionaries. He's the apostle to the Germans. That's the way we remember him in English language historiography. According to tradition, he's born in Devonshire, England. His Christian name is actually Winfrid, but Pope Gregory II names him Boniface in one of his letters to him. And this is one of the very important officials that we have exchanging letters with Boniface. The name Boniface, of course, means one who does good. We know very little about his early years. Neither exactly where he was born nor exactly when. It seems probable, however, that he was born around 675. 675, and I guess I've written 672 up on the board, but somewhere in that area. Another chap who I haven't written up on the board, but whose name also begins with W, Willibald, is one of these exceptionally, I'll just write it up here for you. Willibald. Why didn't they have normal names like John? Yeah. Willibald is this very, very well-traveled Anglo-Saxon churchman. He writes during the life. He writes the life of Saint Boniface. So not only do we have actual letters from Saint Boniface, but we even have a little biography about him. And from his writings, we get this wonderful glimpse of the state of the church in the 8th century. We're really beginning to enter the Dark Ages, or what's called the Dark Ages. Why Dark Ages? Because we have so little information about it, even if we object to the idea of this historiographical scheme of having the Dark Ages. That was a term introduced by Petrarch at the beginning of the Renaissance period as he looked back to this time and thought that he was entering a new time of light and expansion of human intellect and scientific knowledge and so on. As Petrarch looked back, Petrarch, this wonderful humanist, at this time when the Renaissance was really starting to take off, or in seminal form, it was just beginning. He looks back and calls these times the Dark Ages. Even if we disagree with his assessment of why, it still is a time where there's tremendously little information. We have so little information about this period. But Boniface is a wonderful window into the state of the church in the 8th century in Europe. Boniface was a sharp student. Even at an early age, he showed interest in religious life. His father initially disapproved, but gave him permission to follow a religious life after he had recovered from this desperate illness as a young person. Boniface joins the local monastery, and you have to understand that they didn't have Moody Bible Institute at that time, or there was no university system. There was no formal academic system the way you understand it. So to join the monastery is both to choose a life of religious devotion, and it's also to become theologically educated. At that time, to join a monastery was to do all of the above. It was the equivalent of going to Bible college. It was the equivalent of becoming a missionary. It was the equivalent of becoming a Bible translator. It was like all of our options rolled into one sweet life. I really think it needs a revival, but that's probably for you to do because I'm already married. But see what you can do to get that back. Or maybe we just need to restructure it such. I don't know. Anyway, the monastery was this lifeline for the church through these very difficult years. Boniface joins a monastery, as so many of these other Christian greats will during this period. He's said to have written the Latin grammar during these early years as a teacher. He excelled as a teacher, and when he's 30, he's ordained a priest. At this time, I think, as well as in antiquity, you couldn't become well, you couldn't be ordained a bishop before 30, but he's ordained a priest at this time. Boniface longs to be a missionary. That's his real spiritual passion. And why? It's not entirely clear. He's well received in his community. He has a stable life. He's excelling as a teacher. He's engaged with people. He has a place in a society. And yet, there's simply a discontent that he experiences with the limitations of where the gospel is. He's bound and determined to bring the gospel to new places. And as we look back at his letters, we can see that he's a very sharp student of the scriptures. He is a huge student of the Apostle Paul's writings in particular. Boniface may have received his desire to become a missionary from Paul. This would probably be the case for many of you who choose mission work Paul, the Apostle Paul, of course, is the great model for that life. Boniface does not have an easy time getting permission from his superiors to leave as a missionary. Eventually, however, he does succeed in 716. So how old would he be by then? He's going to be about 44, something like that, if I've done the math rightly. When he's in his middle-aged years in 716, he and a few of his comrades head out from London. They head to London and then take a boat across the English Channel into modern-day Holland. And of course, the friends that are packing up with him and going are also monks. He works as a reformer in Germany. There are already some churches. Churches, of course, had been, Christianity had been spreading up into northern Europe for a long time in a small way, as in trickles of Christianity have been spreading up for a long time. So there are already churches in Germany, but he's working as a reformer. He's trying to unify them, to get them in communication with one another. Boniface is laboring to bring them into an established ecclesiastical network in alignment with the Roman Church, to establish communication with Rome. And Boniface he actually succeeds in a very large way. Part of his legacy is turning the attention of Rome from the east over to the continent, to the western part of the continent, so to the north and to the west of Rome. Constantinople, excuse me, still struggling with that blasted cold, I'm so sorry. Constantinople had been for a long time the focus of the Roman Church. They had looked to Constantinople for significant partnerships and leadership and economic and military stability. But Boniface is so successful in bringing these northern churches and western churches into communication with Rome that in some way Rome begins looking to the west again. Some would say that part of Boniface's legacy, and this is pretty grand, but some would even say that Boniface's legacy is laying the path for the establishment of the Holy Roman Empire. That is, establishing in the German imagination, in the Roman imagination, this idea of a Christian Europe. Boniface is part of the reason why, during Charlemagne's time, people can imagine a Christian Europe. His mission is just that successful. I have not put Boniface's letters on the great books list of the options that you would have to read, but I'd like to make that available to you if any of you want to read Boniface's letters as your next book review due on November 25th. That's an option to you. That's just really a great window. Any of you who are thinking about mission work, why don't you read about one of the greatest missionaries who ever lived? Why don't you read about Boniface? In the words of the author of Hebrews, time fails us to speak of Saint Ansgar and Cyril and Methodius and the conversion of Russia and the Nestorian mission to Asia, and on and on and on. There's so many other of these Latin missions that head out during this time when the real power of the Roman Empire is waning. Let's see, this slide that I'm showing you here, I believe, is the burial place of Boniface, if I've got that right, in Fulda, Germany. Here's the outside of the cathedral. and time indeed fails us. I'm going to have to jump us onward to the next lecture topic that we need to be talking about. But let me just take questions from you. If any of you have any questions or reflections very quickly about any of the Latin missionaries that we've been talking about. Chase, I want to hear from you. Was there any mission work before 500 AD? Well, you know what? I'm so sorry. Can I just cough for a minute? Was there any missions work before 500 AD? Well, most certainly, but let's talk about what you mean by mission work. What about the Apostle Paul? and you remember me saying that he has, if you just chart out in the New Testament, no fewer than about 30 people that we know that he was working with. He calls fellow workers, fellow laborers, and so on. So from the get-go, there had been mission work and organized attempts to spread the gospel and communicate the Christian message. However, our idea of what we think of missionary work, especially what is made a permanent or changed our imagination permanently in our place in culture about mission work, that would be what has done that would be the last 2 centuries of Protestant mission work. If you're like me, when you think of a missionary, you think of a faith missionary, i.e. someone like Hudson Taylor, who raises support and goes out, not necessarily sent by a denomination. You're not thinking about a church planter probably, or a pastor, but you're thinking about a missionary who goes out as an auxiliary arm of a church to create new churches. But if they're going out as a pastor, we don't tend to think of that as mission work. So when we speak of mission work, we're talking about a very specialized form of Christian service that's different from pastoral ministry. If you think like me in those distinctions that I've made, Chase, then not much of that is taking place in the early years. Some monks will do things like that. So most of the stories that we've talked about are outgrowths from monasteries. Columba leaving his monastery because of tragedy and exiling himself, but the Spirit of God working dramatically, and he's having a very fruitful ministry there to Scotland. Or Patrick, who's kidnapped and goes out against his will, but who ultimately works in monastic networks when he returns to Ireland for missionary service. The sending of Augustine of Canterbury, that's sending monks to create more monasteries. And these other folks too, Winfrid most famously, of course, is operating from a monastic community. So with the distinctions that I've made, no, there are not really many missionaries, if any, in these early periods. But you can see that the monastic system was reproducing itself strategically for many of the same purposes that the great missionaries of the last 2 centuries in the Protestant world have been doing as well. Is that helpful, Chase? You can see that the structure of Christianity, the organization of it, has changed. And so our structures are different than they were back then. And who knows? They may continue to change. But, Josh, I can see you've got a question. It was. And I know you've studied out the date of Easter quite a bit, haven't you? Yep. Yes. That question just keeps coming up in church history, doesn't it? We have this fight between Irenaeus and Victor of Rome in the 2nd century, where we almost have this division between Christianity in Asia Minor and Roman Christianity back in the 2nd century, with the date of Easter, or the celebration of the Passover, the celebration of, yes, the Passover, the Christian celebration of the Passover, as the dividing line. We have that as one of the main objectives, the agenda items at the Council of Nicaea. I'm not sure if I mentioned that when I was talking about Nicene theology, but one of the big things that all the bishops also gathered to talk about was the celebration of Easter. They're still fighting about it here in the 6th, 7th century at the Synod of Whitby. Yes, Josh, good. Why didn't they just come up with, a clock or something like that? Yeah, of course, they didn't have clocks, and time is dealt with very differently in antiquity than it is today. A very interesting story that we won't get into is the rise of the clock in the 1400s. Eventually, people figure out how to make clocks, and that changes society. You can almost see it as sort of a precursor to the computer. It's this bit of technology that changes the way society organizes itself, and brings about it an ability to measure time in much more precise ways. Okay, if there are no further questions, then let me take us on from this period. Let me talk to you a little bit about early Christian art. There's 2 other topics which we may get to in our remaining time. Let me talk to you a little bit about early Christian art, and I'm just going to throw that section here in as a bit of a freebie. We're leaving the early period of the period of the early church. We're going to move quickly into the Middle Ages, and we'll be moving at a much faster pace than we have for the early periods in this class, both because there are fewer sources and because I'm not a specialist in the Middle Ages. So I'm an early church historian. I particularly relish the early years, but there's also some legitimacy, universal legitimacy to the approach that we've taken. There's just so much more literature in these early years of the church while the Roman Empire is intact and while people have educational opportunities. And sources just drop dramatically as we enter the 7th, 8th, 9th centuries. There's just much, much less material for us to investigate. So as we leave that, let me talk to you a little bit about Christian art, and I'm just going to throw that in as a freebie. And then with the remaining time that we have, I'd like to begin to talk about what's happening on in the eastern part of the empire. The story that we've closed off is that the Western Empire has fallen, but some good has come out of that with Christian missions. Well, what's happening in the East at this time? Those 2 points will occupy our time for the rest of this hour. Early Christian art. Let's just talk about it. I was at a conference now 2 years ago in Chicago, the North American Patristic Society Conference, and there, Robin, I think her name is Robin Jensen, I think I've got that name right, a prominent historian in early Christian art. She's married to a patristic scholar too, so it's this married duo that's working on Christian art and interpretation of sacred texts. At this conference, Robin Jensen gave this wonderful lecture about how we need to incorporate art into the Christian history curriculum. And I was totally sold on it. Now she was speaking to a group of probably about 300 of us, early church historians, and she said something that may surprise you. She said something to the effect of, I know you're all intimidated by art, and I know that you're all specialists in texts and deal with Christian antiquity from a very textual point of view, but you need to get visually engaged with ancient Christianity as well. And speaking to this room of 300 PhDs in early church history, they were all scared to death to actually show slides of Christian art because none of us have any technical expertise in it. Let me just share with you and confess to you that I'm not an art historian. I know nothing about art, but following Robin Jensen's good idea that just show art and talk about it, even if you're all de-skilled and don't have technical words to describe what you're looking at, it's still a valuable venue to understand something of the history of Christian antiquity. So with that apology in hand, I plunge into this exercise with you. And that's my desire that we actually do explore art in Christian antiquity and whatever portion of church history that we're dealing with. My desire for that is partially reflected in your Sacred Space projects too. I'm really looking forward to examining communally what you've come up with in those projects. This is the Capella Greca of the Catacomb and the Priscilla of Rome. I know one of you, can I see a show of hands? How many of you, where are you who've actually been working on this project? One of the groups have actually put together a wonderful exploration and exhibit on the Greek Capella. Are you all gone today? Oh, you're there. Okay, thanks. So this group over here has worked on this. This catacomb preserves some of the earliest explicitly Christian art that we have. In very early Christianity, we don't have church buildings. At least we have an exceptionally few number of them preserved today. But this is an exception. This is a space that was used for Christian worship that dates to the 2nd century. And because it's underground, has been preserved. So the catacombs, of course, are underground. There are literally hundreds of miles of catacombs, these burial places, these passageways of burial places underneath Rome, not all of which were used for Christian purposes, but many of which were. And sometimes these passageways are very narrow, very small, very cave-like, but once in a while they open up into a space that was used explicitly for Christian worship, and because it's protected from the elements, we have this wonderful opportunity to actually observe Christian art from this extremely early strata of Christianity. All right, following Robin Jensen's good advice, I'm just going to ask you, what am I looking at? What is this? It dates from the 2nd century. It's one of the earliest pieces of Christian visual art that we have. What is this? Go ahead, please. No, I don't mind truth. Go ahead. It's thought to be. Correct. Great. The earliest depiction of Mary and Jesus. Here you can see a woman holding a nursing infant. And we've got somebody in the background who do you think this guy is? Your guess is probably better than mine. Sure could be an angel. Oh, look at that. Keep forgetting that you can't see my cursor. This guy here in the background could be an angel. Looks to me like he's got some sort of writing tablet there. Maybe an iPhone 6. He's got a tablet. Right. Now, let me just run you through this exercise. How confident do you feel about your own interpretation of this piece? What's very interesting to me is, as long as scholars don't disagree, we're all really confident about that it's Mary. This is Jesus. This is one of the earliest depictions of Christ. And yet, when people start disagreeing, the whole thing comes apart because there's no way to prove it. So this piece, I think, is largely, actually Robin Jensen has talked us through this piece. There is controversy over this. Scholars spoil everything. But as long as there's no polemic involved, it seems clear what the interpretation would be. The problem is there's no way to verify interpretation of this material. All right, also in the Greek catacomb, what am I looking at here? What is this? Sure looks to me like the Last Supper. Right, and so the title of this usually is the breaking of the bread. That's what people will refer to this mosaic as, or it's not technically a mosaic, but this fresco. Good. Unfortunately, there's scholars do spoil everything. They've spoiled the interpretation of this as well. You can't get it's not universally received as such. But good. Oh, what is this? What is this, Doc? What is this a picture of? Yes. Right. These are the 3 children in Jewish tradition. The Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. Why do they have their hands up? Correct. They're worshiping. What does this mean? And even further than that, Jerusalem? Even further, perhaps? It means all of those, but it specifically means prayer. Right? This is the way that you pray in ancient Christian antiquity. You hold up your hands. Right? Here is the orante, you call it. That's the Latin name for the praying one. The orante here. And this is the posture that people would assume in prayer. So when you see this in very early Christian art, they may or may not be in ecstasy or seeing a vision or something like that, but that's the posture of prayer. That's how people pray. And you remember, too, when Paul says that he would that all men lift up hands in prayer? That's what he's talking about. This is the way the early Christians prayed. Good. So the shots that I just showed you there date as some of the very earliest Christian art, unusually preserved because it's underground. And here, let me show you one picture here of the catacomb. I can't recall which catacomb this was. It's not St. Priscilla's catacomb, but there we are celebrating a communion service in the catacomb. They allow religious groups to do this. Christian groups come through. And this was in 2011, but Brian Litfin and I were with a group of Moody students in the catacomb. Well, we were going through Italy and also Germany, and there we were celebrating the Eucharist down underground. There were other Christian groups around, so through the hallways you'd actually hear people singing different Christian songs in different languages. It was a pretty cool experience. Brian Litfin was running through collecting bones. I was like, oh, Brian, what are you doing? Trying to get us some sort of Italian jail. Okay. Let's look at this. The sarcophagus of Santa Maria Antiqua dates from the late 3rd century. And note that that's pre-Constantinian. right? Constantine comes in the early 4th century, Edict of Milan in 313. So this is a pre-Constantinian piece of Christian art, and that's significant because while Christianity was on the underground, while Christianity was expecting persecution or opposition from government authorities, they might not have produced Christian art the same way that they would in a post-Constantinian context, right? And you can clearly see that for 2 reasons. Both because art is very expensive, and then because explicitly Christian art, you may or may not want to draw attention to the fact you might not want to advertise the fact that your worship space is Christian and so on in a time of persecution. But primarily for the first reason, because Christian art, like all art, is very expensive. There's really not much of it from the pre-Constantinian era. This sarcophagus is unique in that it's extremely well preserved and extremely early. Now, what is a sarcophagus? Somebody taught me past that. Get me through that. What's a sarcophagus, anybody? I'm sorry? Oh, this one does. This one happens to have wonderful carvings on it, but it's not what a sarcophagus, the word, necessarily means. Marcus? The coffin. Yep. Very good, Marcus. Yes, this is a bone box. It's like an ossuary. Sarcophagus, for those of you who know a little Greek, means flesh eater, right? You put the body in this box, the flesh is going to waste away and dissolve to nothing, and eventually you're just going to have a box of bones. So that's what this sarcophagus is for. Now, let's actually look at some of these carvings in detail. What is this? First of all, what is this that we're looking at the center? I want to draw your attention to this figure here. What is this? How would you interpret that? Someone say it just louder. Okay, this is a posture of prayer. Right. Looks like that person's face has been weathered a bit, but this is a sign of Christian prayer. Good. What is happening here? Who's this central figure? Keep talking. Yes, is it David with the sheep? Is this King David? Why would, go ahead. Is it Abel bringing a sacrificial lamb? What else? Marcus? Good. Is it Abraham with a sheep? Yeah, bringing a ram for sacrifice. Good. Any other thoughts of what this could be? Again, there's no way to verify it, except there's sort of a common opinion about what this is. Anybody have? And we haven't hit it yet, although these are all good suggestions. Go ahead, please. Basically, most people assume that this is a picture of Jesus as the Good Shepherd. Most people take it as that. I'm bound and determined to learn your name, so can you remind me of your name, please? Keith. Thanks. I'll get it someday. Thanks, Keith. All right. Most people assume that this is an image of Jesus, the Good Shepherd. Good. Palmer, I failed to do this, but can you pull up a picture of Apollo for us? What I would like to talk to you about here, too, is that many who study this sarcophagus will note that the forms of earliest Christian art are surprisingly similar to the forms in classical art. Now, this is something that may not be quite obvious to us, but those of you who've worked in art with artistic mediums, maybe you'll see this better than the rest of us. Palmer's going to pull up for us an image of Apollo, the Greek god, and many will look at this image here of the Good Shepherd and say, wow, this is actually copied after the likeness, the physical appearance of Apollo, the Greek god. This is the way that Apollo is always shown in antiquity as well. We tend to that may be hard for us to understand. Why would the Christians copy secular art in this regard? Let me put it into a medium that you might understand. Have you noticed that certain movies will copy other movies? You notice that? When I was a kid, I watched a whole lot of Disney films. And there are places in these Disney classic films where the same action would take place. Okay? Let me just give you a silly example, but if it rings any bells, if you've seen these classic Disney films, you might relate to this in some way. Do you remember the scene where Mowgli in the Jungle Book is tackled by Bagheera, the panther, and knocked over and springs back? Do you remember the Jungle Book, that old film? Anyway, for those of you who have seen that, then do you remember The Sword and the Stone? How many of you have seen both The Jungle Book and The Sword and the Stone? This is not for extra credit, I'm just wondering. Okay, I'm wondering if there's a useful illustration. Do you remember when the story in The Sword and the Stone where Wart, the protagonist there, comes into the castle and is knocked over by dogs? The king has two dogs in the palace and he's knocked over. If you watch those two scenes back to back, it's the exact same motion. Why? Well, because it's a complicated scene. I mean, the animators don't have the ability, they don't have computer manipulation at this time back in the 50s when they're producing these films, or whenever it was that they actually produced them. I think The Jungle Book was the 50s and Sword in the Stone later, but they don't have computer animation to actually help them think that through. It was a very complicated scene to have this small boy, either Mowgli or Wart, sprung back and rolled over, and there was a whole bunch of different angles involved. So rather than reinventing that sequence for the second film, The Sword in the Stone, they just replayed the old one. They pulled out the slides, apparently, I mean, it's the same animation, and just sort of copied the new image into that. Or if you've studied film, you'll find that there are these famous scenes that basically are reproduced in other films. This chase scene or this stunt will be reproduced almost exactly in this other cinematic piece. Well, so the medium of our day is film, and there's complexity to it that requires, it's not quite what I was hoping for. Shocking similarity, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah, could we try to get Apollo in the Good Shepherd? Just Google that, see if somebody's got even a back-to-back for us. Sorry, Palmer. The complexity of sculpture in their day was such that Christian artists didn't reinvent the wheel. They recrafted a known metaphor, this idea of Apollo. And they even have some pastoral scenes with Apollo with the sheep. They've repurposed that image, if you will, for Christian use here as the Good Shepherd. If you find an image that works, and excuse me, I should have done that beforehand, Palmer, but if you find a comparison, we'll come back to that. You just get my attention. All right. And to those in the know, many of these images actually would look very similar to classical Greek artwork as well. This piece here. What is it that I'm looking at here? Help me into your world. Why are you laughing? Help me see what you're seeing. Okay, it could be Adam. I mean, is it the arm back? Is that what it is? He looks too relaxed up there? Sure does. What's this? That's not friendly. Yeah. So who is this? What is the scene depicting? What do you see? Give me your best guess. Help us on. What do you see, Josh? Would it be Pete? Did I hear correctly? Peter walking on water? Okay, well, kudos to you for finding out water. Yes. Okay, this man is here lounging here in the water. But what's this all about? That's not Jesus. What's going on there? Help me through. Go ahead. Somebody called it. Yes, it's Jonah. It's Jonah. Of course it is. Good. And look, the whole story is told all at once. We've got Jonah being thrown into the water. Here's the fish that God prepared. I don't know what your child's Sunday school book looked like, but this is the way they envisioned the sea monster of Jonah's story here. Yeah, you just thought it was a killer whale. Okay, here, this is a boat. It's at the edge of the sarcophagus, so you can't see the full image, but that's the boat out of which Jonah would have been thrown. Aha! There we go. Thank you, Palmer. But what is the title of this piece that you found for us? Apollo the Good Shepherd. So you can see, and I'll rewind in just a minute. Please leave that up. Thank you, Palmer. Back to our Jonah story very briefly. Look, this is the gourd that's grown up and provides shade for Jonah. So here is sort of like double duty. He's fallen in the water, but he's also, in the other second scene, he's relaxing underneath the gourd. Yeah, so you've got the whole story of Jonah there. Let's rewind quickly and look here. Whoops. Just so you can see, here's Jesus the Good Shepherd, and here's Apollo the Good Shepherd. What do you notice by way of similarity? How could one make a legitimate claim or an objective claim that this Christian image of Jesus as the Good Shepherd has been modeled after Apollo? What do you notice? What are some similarities? What are some differences? The reality that, yes, there's a sheep over the shoulders. Okay, Marcus? That's very interesting. So the sheep and the shepherd have their faces toward one another. Good. Good. What other similarities do you see? They've both got this wonderful, what is that, contrapposto, is that what you call that? You know, one hip in, one shoulder down. They've both got this classical Greek posture. They're both wearing these sweet boots. They've both got an approximately same length of tunic there. So their clothing is very similar. I don't see a shepherd bag here. Jesus does not seem to have this shepherd bag, although their clothing is very similar. And I can't tell, I honestly just can't tell what that is. Is that the strap of a bag? Or you see these straps coming down across Apollo's chest as well. Is that the same here? I'm not in the know to actually be able to decipher that. Good. But I think you see the point, that there's a striking similarity here. And a striking similarity of theme as well. Apollo the Good Shepherd was a known artistic theme. So kind of like, oh, I don't know, that, again, just to make an appeal to the modern context, like the car chase scene, right? I mean, you've seen so many chase scenes at this point. They vary from one a little bit, but basically you could just replace the people and it's sort of the same movie playing out for the next 5 minutes. It's the same chase scene. How do you get creativity into that, right? Well, just as you've been exposed to lots and lots of chase scenes in films or whatever, you're used to that sequence. So many people have been exposed to Apollo the Good Shepherd. So to see a Christian version of that was not surprising. Okay, back to Jonah. Let me ask you this question, and let me give you a bit of intelligence here. Jonah, if you look at early Christian art, at catacomb art, so if you look at all of do a systematic study of catacomb art, Jonah is going to be the #1 most prominent theme. And you explain that to me. Why is Jonah the most popular Christian visual depiction? Why does everybody want Jonah? Like, here you're the artist. You've been commissioned to decorate this tomb. Everybody wants Jonah. Okay. Why, Keith? Must be. Yes. It's the sign of the resurrection. It's the story of the resurrection in its Old Testament form. Good, Keith. Yep. All right. Let me take us on just a little bit further to look at some other pieces of art here. This here is a very interesting piece of art. It's called the Alexamenos Graffito. It's or also known as the graffito blasfemo, so the blasphemous piece of graffiti. But it's very interesting to Christian historians because although it's blasphemous, it does seem to indicate an awareness, a pagan awareness of Christianity at a very early date. Its date is not set, well, it's not set in stone. Its date is not known for certain, but probably does date from the 2nd or early 3rd century. It's very, very early as far as Christian art or any visual depiction of Christianity goes. It was carved on a plaster wall near the Palatine Hill in Rome, so that's downtown Old Town Rome, and is generally thought to be the earliest known pictorial representation of the crucifixion of Christ. Now you know too that, I'm sure this has been mentioned at some point in your Christian education, that the cross is not a symbol of Christianity at this very early level, early strata. Why? It's too gruesome of an instrument. It's too gruesome of a depiction. The society in early Christianity is too close to the reality of crucifixion to adopt the cross as a symbol of Christianity. So this is a very early depiction of the crucifixion and is a graphic one at that. What do we have here in the graffiti? Now I'm going to show you a schematic where you can see the same but in a clearer form, okay? So you see that image there. I'm going to snap you forward. What is it that we're looking at? Well, you see the Greek word here, Alexamenos. So that's the name, like Alexander. Alexamenos, sebete. And sebete there, that's, if you've learned some Greek, you're saying, why is that C resembling a sigma? Well, so it is. In early Greek, your sigma was written as such. So that is sebete, or worship, thean. Boy, how carelessly written. Theta, epsilon, omicron, well, one crass nu. Okay, so thean. Alexamenos, worship your God. And here is Alexamenos with a hand raised, presumably in reverence, to somebody on a cross with a head of a donkey and the body of a man, and presumably that's Christ in this terrible graffiti representation of it. Now, because of its very early date, people were very excited to find this. It seems to be a pagan jesting of representing the crucifixion. But let me just rewind again so you can see it there. You can go to Rome and study and get an entire PhD degree in ancient Roman graffiti if you wish. So we have a lot of interesting things left to us in graffiti. Do you like graffiti? I really do. I love graffiti. My wife and I actually love graffiti. It's one of the most interesting forms of art. We have so little of it in Spokane. But down by Division, when you take Division down to the freeway, you just come in there. There's actually some very interesting stuff that's starting to develop there. So I think it's a fascinating form of art. And in antiquity as well, there's a lot of it. Okay, comments or questions? Otherwise, I can see that we're not going to get to the eastern part of the empire. I'm going to take the rest of our time and continue to talk to you about early Christian art. Let me share with you some of a little information about the earliest churches that we have. I was in Trier, Germany in 2007, and at that time, the whole city was decked out because they were celebrating the 1700th year anniversary of the wedding of Constantine to his bride, whose name I'm sorry to say I forget. Trier, Germany is the city in Germany with the best preserved and oldest Roman ruins. It has just some wonderful things there for people to see. And while I was there, they were, again, celebrating Constantine, and so they had a replica of that huge marble head of Constantine there and that foot that was left from that statue in Rome. They had a replica of that up for show, and they had some other things. One of the more interesting exhibits that I personally took an interest in was they had a set of models of early churches. And so they had some of the early churches that I'm about to show you here, the church at Europa, at Duras Europa, excuse me, a church that I'm just about to show you about that. And it was about so large on the scale. So They had a tiny little model of it like this. And then I think that was the only pre-Constantinian church that they had, because at this time, it was before a discovery of another pre-Constantinian church that I'm going to show you in 2008, church at Megiddo. So there was this one little model here of this church before Constantine, and then they showed us some of the Constantinian basilicas, which over here were like this big on the models. So like, oh, I don't know, 5, 8 times in length the size, something like that, and many times taller. And as I was looking at that exhibit, I was just struck by the fact, oh yes, the Christian church as we know it didn't always exist. The Christian church is something that comes with the imperialization of Christianity. That's when Christianity as a social movement has the political capital and the financial capital, the social capital, to actually create and maintain these huge edifices. But the Christian church as we know it was not always something that was with Christianity. Let me look with you at some of these pre-Constantinian churches, and I'm going to look at 3 examples of a pre-Constantinian church, the very earliest churches that we have. Then I'm going to look with you at some of the churches that Constantine built. You remember that Constantine had a very aggressive program of building churches for the Christian community that he had newly joined. So he built Old St. Peter's Church in Rome. He built the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. He built what we now call Paul outside the walls in Rome as well. So he builds a number of these wonderful churches. But before Constantine, what did churches look like? Let's look first at what is thought to be the House of Peter. Now, I've never visited, and I'm quite conflicted about the authenticity of this. It's hard for me to imagine that this is genuine, but I've talked to a number of people who have visited and who should know, people who've studied art history and archaeology and so on. And also there's some official bureaus that are quite supportive of the conclusion that this in fact does represent an early Christian church, possibly even the House of Peter. It's been venerated as such from somewhere around the 4th century. And there was a Christian site there already at that time. So there's a number of factors that would suggest that this is in fact the House of Peter. I'm conflicted and can't wait to someday visit. But this is meant to be the House of Peter. Now, what are we looking at? Let me show you a schematic here so you can sort of visualize it. This building, which is the earliest layer that we can really see, that is an octagonal church that was thought to have been built in the 4th century. Egeria, E-G-E-R-I-A, Egeria, this wonderful Spanish nun in the 4th century, the late 4th century, so the 390s, I think, goes around. Actually, I think it was in the early Constantinian years. I'm sorry, so early 4th century. That's must have been the 3. No, I think it was like 390s. Anyway, check me on when Egeria is running around, this wonderful Spanish nun who's sort of a Christian tourist and documents all the things that she's seeing. She saw this octagonal church here, so it must have been there at least by the late 4th century. Underneath that octagonal church is a network of these little houses, and here, this little square part is meant to be the House of Peter. Now, if it is, that would just be mind-blowing, because that's the house. You remember the way that the Gospel of Mark opens up. We have Jesus preaching out from the front door of Peter's house, and all the crowds are coming to him. And remember, those people with great faith open up the tiles of the roof and lower the man in because they can't get into the house. That would have been this. That's Peter's house on the seashore. He was a fisher, not far from the synagogue in Capernaum. So if this is Peter's house, this is just absolutely mind-blowing. It's impossible to know. This is the octagonal church here that was built up over top of the house, and then later we have a Franciscan structure over top of that. So be that as it may, all I want you to know at this point is that it's very, very small. That octagonal church, look, here's the inner part of the, so what are we looking at about that octagonal church in the 4th century? And of course that's post-Constantinian too. That's about, well, if it's 20 yards, it's about 60 feet across. Here, Peter's house, which apparently was used as a house of worship, a Christian house of worship afterwards, that appears to have been about a 30 by 30 foot space. So relatively small for modern standards. Okay, let's look at the Church of Dura Europos, which is the best preserved, unobjectionable or uncontroversial early Christian house of worship. It was found, it's called Dura Europos because Dura Europos is a small little Roman outpost here between the Parthian and the Roman empires. I keep forgetting, you can't see my cursor. Right around here. So just a couple hundred miles away from inland here between the two empires. Often a desert area. It was a part of land that sort of had transferred back and forth from Parthia and to Rome back and forth. But there was a Christian church there. And again, this is the best preserved early Christian, that is pre-Constantinian church that we have. Here's a floor plan. Sorry that slide doesn't preserve the text there correctly. This is the floor plan of the house church of Dura Europa. What do we have here? Well, here's a three-dimensional model of it as well. When I was in Trier in 2007, they had built a replica of it, and I got to actually walk into it. So I entered the door here. This is the entranceway. I entered this little door, and I was just barely able to fit in it. So this was not a conventional 3-foot wide door. This was a tiny little door. The whole building, I can't remember exactly, but it felt about like 30 by 30, something like that. Walked in here. This is the entryway. You come in here, and this is a courtyard. This part of the building here is not roofed. So even on this very, very small structure, only a portion of it actually has a roof. This is a courtyard area, which isn't really a building at all. So you walk into this space here. Here was like a little closet area that was probably used as a meeting room. Here was literally a closet, but it would have been absolutely tiny. Here is a baptistry, and that is what has caused this little church to get so much press time and be so interesting to people. And I'll show you pictures of that baptistry in a moment. The whole church now has been pulled up from Syria and has been moved to Yale University. So if you want to visit this church today, you actually have to go visit New Haven, Connecticut. But Yale University owns this building, and that's where this baptistry is preserved. The baptistry has some wonderful images of early Christian art. I'll show you those in a minute. Here's the main meeting room. This, to my memory, and I'm sorry I don't have a legend there to tell us exactly how long it was, but it was like a, I don't know, 20-foot, 25-foot space by maybe 10 or 12 feet, something like that. And that was the main meeting room for the church. So easily that main meeting space could fit up here in this auditorium platform. It was laid out like a synagogue. You have an altar at one end, and the people have no pews. They stand during the service. And such is the floor plan for the house church. Here is an actual photo of the baptistry, as much of it has been preserved. You can see that this baptismal tank area is not really large enough for a water dunking, baptism by immersion. Of course, you've got to be a little sympathetic to them. The church is out in Syria. Water is very scarce. So you remember me saying that as in the Didache, there's provision. You remember the Didache? You remember me talking about that? This early Christian document from Syria talking about apostolic practice for baptism and the sacraments and so on. Excuse me. Oh, excuse me, I've got a cough again. Terribly sorry. In that document, the Didache, they have provision for if there's not an abundant water supply, you may sprinkle people. And it seems that this baptistry here was meant for baptism by sprinkling as well. What is it that we actually have on the walls? What are these frescoes? You tell me. What are we looking at? And I should remind you that this building dates to about 270 AD. So this is this is, again, among the very earliest Christian art that we have. What is this? Somebody say it, please. This seems to be Jesus, the Good Shepherd again, right? You've got a very sturdy-looking sheep back there on Jesus' shoulders, and here's a flock of sheep. Yep. And given the date, that's one of the earliest depictions of Christ. What am I looking at? What do you see? Please, go ahead. Is it Jesus turning the tables of the money changers? Consensus would be no, but thank you. Please try again. Please do. Go ahead, please. Is it Samson knocking down the doorposts? Again, keep trying, please. Go ahead. No. As far as we know, no. Go ahead, Tony. Give that man some points. Yes, this is thought to be, here's Jesus extending a hand of power, a hand of healing here, to this man who's lame. Now, what's difficult about this image is you've got to understand that this is before they had movies. So this man here is actually, these two figures are representing the same person. We have Jesus healing the man here as he lies helpless on his bed, and this must be the next moment when he stands up, picks up his bed, and he's out walking. Yeah. So this is a healing of the lame man. Thank you, Tony. What am I looking at? Palmer, do you have a quiz for us? Okay, I'll be done in just a minute. What am I looking at? I'll tell you because we don't have time. This is the walking on water. This is Peter and the apostle. Here's Peter, just up ankle deep here in these terrible blusterous waves, and that man extending a hand of power there is Jesus Christ, who's helping him back out of the water. Here, the other disciples looking on in terror. That's where we'll have to end things so that we have some time for the quiz. Please pull out your computers. We'll just pick this up next week with exactly where we left off in the middle of these slides. Thanks. Over to you, Palmer.
You guys know the drill. Can I get a show of hands for who is not prepared to take the quiz right now? Okay. Give you a few seconds. I'm going to go ahead and start for time's sake. If it isn't open yet, just go ahead and write it down. I'll leave the quiz up for half an hour after class. Question 1. This person was a pioneer missionary whose mission this person joined. A, Winfrid, and then the second one would be Boniface. B, Wilfrid and Boniface. C, Willibrord and Wilfrid. D, Willibrord and Boniface. Or E, Boniface and Willibrord. No, this is a terrible question, but it's a little bit fun with the names.
Palmer, can you just give people this one?
I definitely can. For this one, it's going to be D.
You may face this again in the test bank.
Yeah, but it is very confusing with all the W names.
Very effective.
Question 2. I joined the local monastery when I was young and excelled at my studies there, but I really wanted to be a missionary. In 716 AD, some friends and I took a boat into modern-day Holland, and I am known for my work as a reformer in Germany. Who am I? A, Boniface, B, Willibrord, C, Ulfilas, D, Papias, or E, Ansgar? Question 3. What is the site of some of the earliest Christian art? A, the Notre Dame de Paris, B, St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, C, the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, D, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, or E, the Capella Greca in the Catacomb of Priscilla, Rome? Question 4. I was the pro-voice at the Synod of Whitby and introduced the rule of St. Benedict to English monasteries. Who am I? A, Boniface, B, Winfrid, C, Wilfrid, D. Willibrord, or E. Benedict? And question 5. What is the earliest known pictorial representation of the crucifixion of Jesus? A. The Sakalos epitaph. B. The Capella Graeca. C. The sarcophagus of Santa Maria Antiqua. D. The Alexamenos Graffito. Or E. The Domus Petrae. And I will leave the quiz up for about 30 minutes.
Thank you, Palmer. Thanks, Bill and Tim, for working with us. Remember, please, everybody, that we have your Sacred Space submissions due next week. I have all your posters or your model church back in my office. If you want them, I'd like to get those back to you. You can come by anytime. I'm headed to my office now. You can pick them up as well. And the front office is more than willing to print off one more poster for you. So if you want to make changes to the physical printed poster, you have an opportunity to do that. If you just want your poster back, I have it in the office. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next week.